The sound of my 8-year-old son Caleb screaming still echoes in my head 3 weeks later. My sister Jessica had cornered him in our parents' bathroom during Sunday dinner, grabbed my mother's expensive French perfume, and sprayed it directly into his eyes while he begged her to stop. When I ran upstairs and found him clawing at his face, my mother, Carol, laughed from the doorway. If he goes blind now, maybe he won't see he's such a burden, too. My father, David, nodded approvingly. Well, at least he smells better now. I should have known something was wrong when Caleb refused to open his eyes during the 40-minute drive home. He sat curled in his car seat, both hands pressed against his face, making those soft, whimpering sounds that meant he was trying not to have a complete meltdown. Caleb has autism, and loud noises or sudden sensations can send him into sensory overload that takes hours to recover from. But this was different. This wasn't his usual overwhelmed crying. "Mommy, it burns," he whispered for the 10th time since we left my parents' house. "Everything hurts." I pulled into the urgent care parking lot just as the sun was setting. The fluorescent lights inside the medical center would normally bother Caleb, but he didn't even flinch when we walked through the automatic doors. That's when I knew this was serious. My boy, who notices every sound and texture and smell around him, wasn't reacting to anything except the pain in his eyes. The nurse called us back within 10 minutes. Dr. Patterson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, immediately understood the urgency when I explained what happened. She dimmed the examination room lights and spoke in the soft, calm voice that Caleb responds to best. "Can you try to open your eyes for me, sweetie?" she asked, positioning a small flashlight nearby. "I know it hurts, but I need to see what's bothering you." When Caleb finally lifted his eyelids, I gasped. The whites of his eyes were bright red with angry welts around his eyelids where the perfume had made contact. Dr. Patterson's expression grew serious as she examined each eye carefully with her magnifying scope. "Mrs. Harper," she said, stepping away from Caleb and lowering her voice, "this is chemical burn damage. The alcohol and synthetic fragrances in commercial perfumes can cause severe corneal irritation, especially when sprayed directly into the eyes like this." My stomach dropped. Chemical burns. How bad is it? "He's going to need antibiotic drops to prevent infection and steroid drops to reduce the inflammation. If this had been left untreated much longer, he could have developed permanent scarring on his corneas." She paused, studying my face. "Can you tell me exactly how this happened?" I found myself explaining the whole humiliating scene. How Jessica had followed Caleb upstairs when he got overwhelmed by the dinner conversation and needed a quiet space. How she'd trapped him in the bathroom and deliberately sprayed the perfume while he covered his face and begged her to stop. How my parents had watched it happen and laughed. Dr. Patterson's jaw tightened as I spoke. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" "No." I admitted the word tasting bitter. "Jessica knows Caleb can't handle strong smells. She knows he has sensory processing issues. She did this on purpose." The doctor prescribed 2 different eye drops and gave me detailed instructions for care. As we prepared to leave, she handed me a printed summary of Caleb's treatment and diagnosis. "Keep this," she said quietly. "Document everything. If someone deliberately caused chemical burns to a child's eyes, that's not a family dispute. That's assault." The drive home was silent except for Caleb's occasional sniffles. I found myself thinking about all the other times Jessica had accidentally done things that triggered Caleb's sensitivities. The time she forgot and brought a kazoo to his birthday party, then blew it repeatedly while he covered his ears and rocked back and forth. The time she didn't realize that the scented candles she brought to Christmas dinner would make him sick. The time she playfully grabbed his comfort toy and hid it, watching him have a panic attack when he couldn't find it. I'd always made excuses for her. Jessica was going through a difficult divorce. Jessica was stressed about money. Jessica didn't understand autism very well. But sitting in my driveway with my son's injured eyes, still red and swollen, I couldn't make excuses anymore. When I called my mother that evening to tell her about the emergency room visit and the doctor's diagnosis, Carol's response was exactly what I expected. "Oh, Harper, you're being so dramatic. Kids get hurt playing together all the time. Caleb is just more sensitive than other children." "Mom, the doctor said these are chemical burns. Jessica could have blinded him." "Don't you think you're overreacting just a little bit? Jessica would never hurt Caleb on purpose. She loves him." I thought about Dr. Patterson's words about documentation and decided to test something. The medical bill is going to be almost $300 for the emergency visit and the prescription drops. There was a long pause. "Well, that's not our responsibility, Harper. You chose to take him to the doctor. We certainly can't be expected to pay for your medical decisions." The line went dead. My mother had hung up on me. I sat in my kitchen that night watching Caleb struggle with his evening routine because the medicated eye drops made everything blurry. He couldn't read his favorite bedtime story. He couldn't see the pictures on his communication cards clearly. Jessica's prank had disrupted every coping mechanism my son relied on to feel safe in the world. That's when I started the notebook. I wrote down every detail I could remember about the Perfume incident. The time, the location, the exact words my parents had said, the medical diagnosis, the treatment plan, everything. Something told me I was going to need a record of what had happened. I was right, but I had no idea how much more evidence I would need before this was over. 2 weeks later, I was helping Jessica move some boxes from her apartment when she left her phone on the kitchen counter to use the bathroom. The screen lit up with a group text notification, and I saw my name in the preview message. My heart started pounding as I realized it was a group chat between Jessica, my mother, and my father. I shouldn't have looked. I knew it was wrong to invade her privacy, but something in my gut told me I needed to see what they were saying about Caleb and me when they thought I couldn't hear them. I opened the message thread and scrolled back through weeks of conversations. What I found made my hands shake so hard I could barely hold the phone. The messages went back 4 months. 4 months of my family planning ways to toughen up Caleb by deliberately triggering his autism symptoms. 4 months of them calling my son names behind my back. 4 months of them plotting against an 8-year-old child. Carol had written, "Maybe if we push him hard enough, he'll snap out of this autism nonsense. Harper babies him too much." David had replied, "Hide his noise-canceling headphones at the next gathering. Force him to deal with normal sound levels like other kids." Jessica had sent, "I tried the scented candle thing at Christmas. He almost threw up from the smell. Harper got so mad, but maybe he'll learn to control himself better." My mother had responded, "Good. We need to show Harper that accommodating his every little sensitivity isn't helping anyone. He needs to learn to cope with the real world." The thread continued with dozens of messages planning interventions for Caleb. They discussed hiding his favorite foods and replacing them with textures he couldn't tolerate. They planned to surprise him with loud music during family gatherings. They talked about losing his comfort items and making him function without them. But it was the recent messages sent just days after the Perfume incident that made me feel physically sick. Jessica had written, "Mission accomplished with the Perfume." Harper totally freaked out and took him to the doctor. Maybe she's finally seeing how much trouble he is. Carol had replied, "Perfect. Did you see how he couldn't even eat dinner after that? Maybe he'll start refusing to come to family meals." David had added, "We're doing this for Harper's own good. She needs to face reality about that boy's future. He's never going to be normal." I screenshot every single message before I heard Jessica's footsteps coming back down the hallway. My hands were trembling as I closed the phone and pretended to be organizing boxes. When Jessica returned, chatting casually about her new apartment, I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. The sister I'd grown up with, the person I'd trusted with my deepest fears about raising a special needs child, had been secretly plotting against my son for months. She'd been causing his meltdowns on purpose, then watching me struggle to help him recover, knowing exactly what she'd done to trigger his distress. That night, I went through my calendar and cross-referenced it with the message timestamps. Every single accident involving Caleb at family gatherings had been planned in advance. The missing comfort toy, the surprise loud noises, the overwhelming smells, the food sabotage, all of it had been deliberate. I remembered Caleb asking me after the Christmas incident why Aunt Jessica was trying to hurt him. I'd reassured him that Jessica loved him and would never hurt him on purpose. I told him he was being too sensitive, that he needed to try harder to get along with family. I had gaslighted my own child to protect the people who were abusing him. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't a case of family members who didn't understand autism. This wasn't about them being insensitive or needing education about Caleb's needs. This was a coordinated campaign of abuse designed to break down my son's coping mechanisms and make him appear more difficult than he actually was. But why? What could they possibly gain from making Caleb suffer? I didn't have to wait long to find out. I decided to visit my parents under the pretense of wanting to work things out. I brought Caleb with me, but this time I came prepared. I had a small recording device hidden in my purse, and I'd practiced staying calm no matter what they said. I needed to understand their true motivations, and I suspected they'd be more honest if they thought I was backing down. "I'm glad you came to your senses," my mother said as she opened the front door. She barely glanced at Caleb, who was staying close to my side and wearing his noise-canceling headphones as a precaution. My father was sitting in his recliner reading the newspaper, but he looked up when we entered the living room. "Harper, we need to have a serious conversation about Caleb's future. You can't keep pretending that everything is normal." I forced myself to sound uncertain and defeated. I don't know what to do anymore. The medical bills are getting so expensive, and he's having more meltdowns lately. Maybe you're right that I'm not handling this well. Carol's eyes lit up with something that looked like satisfaction. Finally, some honesty. We've been trying to tell you for months that this situation isn't sustainable. That boy needs more structure than you can provide. "What kind of structure?" I asked, setting my purse where the recording device could pick up their voices clearly. David folded his newspaper and leaned forward. "Professional care. There are residential facilities specifically designed for children like Caleb, places where he can get the intensive therapy he needs without disrupting a normal household." My blood ran cold, but I kept my voice steady. "Residential facilities? You mean like sending him away?" "Not permanently," Carol said quickly, "just until he learns better coping skills. You have to think about your own future, Harper. You're 32 years old. You could still meet someone and have a normal family, but not with Caleb's constant needs holding you back." I glanced at my son, who was sitting on the floor with a picture book, seemingly absorbed in the illustrations, but probably hearing every word despite his headphones. "I don't want a different family. Caleb is my family." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that's keeping you both stuck," David said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone I remembered from childhood. "You're so focused on accommodating his disability that you're not seeing the bigger picture." "What bigger picture?" Carol moved closer and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Honey, there are government benefits available for families dealing with autism. Social Security disability payments, state assistance programs, respite care funding. But you have to be realistic about his limitations to qualify for the support you need." I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole. "What does that have to do with residential care?" "Everything," David said bluntly. "If Caleb is living in a specialized facility, you can still receive benefits as his guardian while having the freedom to rebuild your own life. It's a win-win situation." The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made me nauseated. "You want me to put Caleb in an institution so I can collect disability benefits?" "We want what's best for both of you," Carol said firmly. "And what's best is acknowledging that you're overwhelmed and need professional help. There's no shame in admitting when you're in over your head." I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard. While walking down the hallway, I passed my father's home office and noticed the door was slightly open. I could see papers scattered across his desk, and something made me step closer for a better look. Financial documents, legal papers, and right on top a folder labeled Trust and Estate Planning. I glanced back toward the living room where I could hear Carol talking to Caleb in the overly sweet voice she used when she was trying to appear caring. David was in the kitchen getting drinks. I had maybe 2 minutes. I slipped into the office and quickly photographed the documents on the desk. What I found made everything crystal clear. My grandfather had died 2 years ago, and apparently he'd left me $50,000 in his will. $50,000 that was supposed to be released to me when I turned 30. I was now 32, and I'd never received a penny. According to the legal documents I was photographing, my parents had filed paperwork claiming the money should be held in trust for the care and benefit of Caleb Harper, a disabled minor child. They had forged my signature on forms stating that I was unable to manage the inheritance due to financial instability caused by caring for a special needs dependent. They had stolen my inheritance and were using it to fund Jessica's lifestyle. Bank statements showed regular transfers to Jessica's account, labeled as family support and child care assistance. My sister's new car, her apartment deposits, her credit card payments, all of it was being paid for with money that my grandfather had left to me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the draft legal documents at the bottom of the pile, papers that would give my parents legal guardianship of Caleb if I was deemed unable to provide adequate care. Papers that would allow them to make all medical and educational decisions for my son. Papers that would give them access to all of his Social Security and disability benefits. Papers that would make them Caleb's legal caretakers while keeping him in a residential facility that they would never have to visit. I heard footsteps coming down the hallway and quickly put the documents back where I found them. When David appeared in the doorway, I was standing by his bookshelf, pretending to look at family photos. "Find what you were looking for," he asked, and there was something in his tone that made me think he knew exactly what I'd discovered. "Just looking at old pictures," I said casually. "I should get Caleb home soon. He gets tired when his routine is disrupted too much." David nodded slowly. "Of course. Wouldn't want him to have another one of his episodes. That wouldn't be good for anyone." As I collected Caleb and prepared to leave, my parents made one final push. "Think about what we discussed today," Carol said, hugging me goodbye with an affection that now felt completely artificial. "We only want what's best for you both. And Harper, you know we'll always be here to support you when you're ready to make the right decision." During the drive home, I felt like I was seeing my entire childhood through a new lens. How many times had my parents offered to help me in ways that ultimately benefited them more than me? How many times had they convinced me that my judgment was wrong and their perspective was the only reasonable one? But this time was different. This time they had miscalculated. They thought they were manipulating a confused single mother who was overwhelmed by her son's disability. What they didn't realize was that they were dealing with a woman who would do anything to protect her child. And now I had evidence of their crimes. I needed help, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. Most of my old friends had drifted away after Caleb was born, partly because of the challenges of maintaining friendships while managing his needs, but also because my parents had encouraged me to isolate myself. They'd convinced me that other people wouldn't understand our situation. Then I remembered Emma. Emma Rodriguez had been my roommate in college, and we'd lost touch after graduation, when life pulled us in different directions. But I knew she'd gone to law school, and I was desperately hoping she might be able to give me advice about my situation, even if she couldn't represent me directly. I found Emma's law firm online and called during my lunch break at work, my heart pounding as I waited to see if she'd even remember me. When the receptionist transferred me to Emma's office, I heard that familiar laugh that I remembered from our late-night study sessions. "Harper Williams, I cannot believe it's really you. How long has it been? 8 years? 9? 10 years? I said, surprised by how emotional I felt just hearing a friendly voice. "Emma, I know this is out of nowhere, but I'm in some serious trouble and I didn't know who else to call." Her voice immediately shifted to professional concern. "What kind of trouble are you safe right now?" I gave her a brief overview of the situation: Caleb's autism, my family's escalating abuse, the Perfume incident, the text messages I'd discovered, and the financial fraud I'd uncovered. Emma listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she was taking detailed notes. "Harper, this is much more serious than you might realize," she said when I finished explaining. "What you're describing constitutes multiple criminal charges: child abuse, conspiracy, financial fraud, identity theft. And that's just what you've told me so far." I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally believed me and understood the severity of the situation. Terror because the legal implications were bigger than I'd imagined. "The thing is," Emma continued, "I specialize in family law. This is exactly the kind of case I handle. And if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to represent you pro bono. Cases like this are why I went to law school in the first place." Emma explained that she'd gone into family law after witnessing similar dynamics in her own extended family. She'd seen how financial abuse and emotional manipulation could destroy families, and she dedicated her career to helping victims fight back through legal channels. "The first thing we need to do is gather all the evidence you have and organize it properly for both criminal and civil proceedings," she said. "Can you come to my office tomorrow evening? Bring everything: the medical records, the photographs of the documents, screenshots of the text messages, anything and everything." That night, I created a comprehensive file with every piece of evidence I'd collected. I printed out the photos of the financial documents, organized the screenshots of the text messages chronologically, and gathered all of Caleb's medical records related to the Perfume incident and his autism diagnosis. When I met Emma at her law office the next evening, I was amazed by how seriously she took everything. She reviewed each piece of evidence, methodically making notes and asking detailed questions about timelines and relationships. "Harper, this case is even stronger than I thought," she said after reviewing everything. "Your parents have committed fraud on multiple levels. They stole your inheritance. They forged your signature on legal documents, and they've been filing false reports about your parenting to various agencies." My heart stopped. "What false reports?" Emma had run a background check on our family situation and discovered something I'd been completely unaware of. "Your mother has been calling social services monthly for the past 6 months, filing complaints about your care of Caleb. She's been telling them that you neglect his medical needs, that you're financially unstable, and that you're emotionally abusive." I felt like the room was spinning. "But that's not true. None of that is true." "I know that, and we can prove it. But Harper, their goal is clear now. They've been building a case to have Caleb removed from your care so they can obtain legal guardianship. That would give them access to his disability benefits, your inheritance, and complete control over his placement." Emma explained the legal strategy my parents had been using. By filing repeated complaints with social services, they were creating a paper trail that made me appear to be an unfit mother. By stealing my inheritance and claiming financial instability, they were building evidence that I couldn't provide for Caleb's needs. By deliberately triggering his autism symptoms at family gatherings, they were creating situations where he appeared more severely disabled than he actually was. They were planning to use the Perfume incident as evidence that you left Caleb unsupervised with someone who might harm him, Emma said. Jessica was going to testify that she was trying to help him with hygiene issues and that his extreme reaction proved he needed more professional care than you could provide. The scope of their manipulation was breathtaking. They hadn't just been abusing Caleb for their own entertainment, they'd been systematically building a legal case to take him away from me. "But we can stop them," Emma said firmly. "We have evidence of their conspiracy, proof of the financial fraud and medical documentation that contradicts their claims about your parenting. We can file criminal charges and civil suits simultaneously." She explained that the case would likely attract attention from the state attorney general's office, since financial fraud involving disability benefits and inheritance theft were priorities for prosecution. I might not be the only victim of my parents' manipulative tactics. "There's something else," Emma said as we prepared to end the meeting. "I think we should contact Jessica directly, Based on the text messages, it seems like she might have been coerced into participating in their plan. If we can get her to cooperate with our case, it would strengthen our position significantly. I thought about my sister, who I'd once trusted completely, who had been deliberately hurting my son for months. Part of me wanted to see her face criminal charges along with my parents. But another part of me remembered that Jessica had always been the family member my parents controlled most easily. Maybe she was as much a victim as Caleb and I were. "Let me think about it," I told Emma. "I need some time to process everything you've told me." As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months' hope. For the first time since the Perfume incident, I had a plan. I had legal representation. I had evidence that could protect my son and expose my family's crimes. But most importantly, I finally understood that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting, and I wasn't alone. Emma believed me. The evidence supported my experiences, and soon my family would face consequences for what they'd done. I was ready to fight back. Emma's legal investigation moved faster than I expected. 3 days after our initial meeting, she called me with news that made my stomach drop. "Harper, I need you to sit down for this. I've been digging into the social services reports your mother filed, and the situation is worse than we thought." I was at work, but I found an empty conference room and closed the door. "How much worse?" "Your mother hasn't just been calling social services monthly. She's been systematically building a case file that spans 8 months. She's filed 14 separate reports claiming various forms of neglect and abuse." My hands started shaking. "What kind of reports?" Emma's voice was carefully controlled the way lawyers speak when they're delivering devastating news. "She's claimed that you frequently leave Caleb alone for hours at a time. She's told them you refuse to provide him with necessary medical care. She's reported that you're financially unstable and can't afford food or housing. She's even claimed that you're emotionally abusive and that Caleb is afraid of you." Each accusation hit me like a physical blow. But none of that is true. I have records proving all of that is false. "I know and will use those records. But Harper, there's more. Social Services has been conducting what they call wellness checks at your address. They've been coming by your house when you're at work, talking to neighbors, checking with Caleb's school." I felt the room spinning around me. I never knew about any wellness checks. Nobody ever contacted me. "That's because your mother told them you'd been coached on how to fool investigators. She convinced them that surprise visits were the only way to get accurate information about your parenting." Emma explained that Carol had been incredibly strategic in her approach. She'd started with minor complaints that seemed credible, then gradually escalated to more serious allegations. She'd provided specific dates and times for incidents that supposedly occurred, creating the illusion of detailed first-hand knowledge. "But here's the thing that really concerns me," Emma continued. "Social Services has scheduled a formal investigation meeting with you for next Friday. They were planning to inform you tomorrow." My blood ran cold. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where they determine whether Caleb should be removed from your care while they conduct a more thorough investigation. Harper, if we hadn't discovered this now, you could have lost custody of Caleb by next weekend." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the timeline. My family had been planning this for months. While I was struggling to help Caleb recover from their deliberate abuse, they were simultaneously building a legal case to take him away from me permanently. "There's something else," Emma said gently. "I think I know why they've accelerated their timeline. I found some financial documents that suggest your father has been researching legal guardianship procedures and disability benefit regulations." She explained that David had been systematically studying how to gain legal control over disabled dependents. He downloaded guides about guardianship applications, researched residential care facilities, and calculated potential monthly income from combining Caleb's Social Security benefits with state assistance programs. "They've been treating this like a business plan," Emma said. "Your son isn't their grandson to them. He's a revenue stream they want to control." That evening, I sat down with Caleb while he worked on his homework, watching him concentrate on his math problems with the same focused determination he brought to everything he cared about. His eyes had healed completely from the perfume burns, but he still flinched whenever someone approached him too quickly. Jessica's attack had left invisible wounds that were taking much longer to recover from. "Mommy, why does Grandma call those people about me?" he asked without looking up from his worksheet. I froze. "What people, sweetheart?" "The people who ask questions about if you take care of me good. Mrs. Johnson next door told me that a lady comes sometimes and asks about you." My heart broke a little more. Even our neighbor had been drawn into my mother's web of lies, probably thinking she was helping a concerned grandmother gather information about her daughter's parenting. "What did Mrs. Johnson tell the lady?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Caleb finally looked up at me with those serious eyes that seemed too old for his 8-year-old face. "She told her that you're the best mommy in the whole neighborhood and that you take care of me better than anybody. She said the lady seemed mad about that answer." I hugged Caleb tightly, overwhelmed by gratitude for neighbors who'd seen through my mother's manipulation and anger that my son had been aware of surveillance he shouldn't have had to endure. That night, I called Emma with an update about what Caleb had shared. She took detailed notes about Mrs. Johnson's interactions with the social services investigator, explaining that neighbor testimonies could be crucial evidence in our favor. "Harper, I think it's time to contact the investigator directly and request a meeting before their scheduled interview," Emma said. "We need to get ahead of this situation and present our evidence before they make any decisions based on your mother's false reports." She arranged for me to meet with Detective Williams, a specialist in family fraud cases, and Social Services Supervisor Patricia Martinez the following morning. Emma would be there to represent me, and we'd present all the evidence of my family's conspiracy at once. "This is going to be overwhelming," Emma warned me. "You're going to learn things about your family's criminal behavior that will be difficult to process. But remember, every piece of evidence we uncover makes your case stronger and protects Caleb more effectively." As I prepared for the meeting, I realized that my family's greatest mistake had been underestimating me. They'd assumed I would never discover their plan, never fight back, never find the resources to defend myself and my son. They'd counted on me remaining the passive, overwhelmed single mother they'd been conditioning me to be for years. They were about to discover how wrong they'd been. I decided to meet with Jessica before the official investigation meeting. I needed to understand her role in the conspiracy, and Emma thought there might be a chance she'd cooperate with our case if she understood the serious legal consequences she was facing. I arranged to meet Jessica at the coffee shop where we used to study together in high school, hoping the familiar setting might encourage honesty between us. When she arrived, she looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before. Her usual confident demeanor was replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "Harper, I'm glad you called," she said, settling into the booth across from me. "I've been wanting to talk to you about what happened with Caleb." I decided to start with a direct approach. "I know about the text messages, Jessica. I saw the group chat with Mom and Dad." Her face went completely white. For a long moment, she just stared at me with her mouth slightly open, clearly trying to figure out how much I knew and how much she could deny. "I can explain," she finally said, but her voice was shaking. "Then explain. Explain how you planned to hurt my son. Explain how you coordinated with our parents to abuse an 8-year-old child. Explain how you thought that was acceptable." Jessica started crying, which surprised me. In all the years we'd been sisters, I'd rarely seen her show genuine emotion. She was usually so controlled, so manipulative in her interactions with everyone around her. "Harper, you don't understand. I never wanted to hurt Caleb. I love him." "You have a funny way of showing love," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the screenshots of her text messages. "You wrote that you were happy he almost threw up from the scented candles. You bragged about making him have a panic attack." Jessica looked at the phone screen and her crying intensified. "They made me do it. Mom and Dad, they threatened me." "Threatened you? How?" "You know, I've been struggling since my divorce. I lost my apartment, I couldn't find steady work, my credit cards were maxed out. Mom and Dad were the only reason I wasn't homeless." She explained that our parents had been supporting her financially for almost a year, but their help came with conditions. Carol and David had convinced her that I was damaging Caleb by enabling his disability, and that they needed evidence to prove I was an unfit mother. They said you were hurting him by not getting him proper treatment. They said he needed professional care that you couldn't afford, and that the family had to intervene before you ruined his whole life. I stared at my sister, trying to understand how she could have believed such obvious lies. Jessica, you've seen how I care for Caleb. You've seen how much I love him and how hard I work to give him everything he needs. I know, but they made it sound like love wasn't enough. They showed me articles about autism and residential programs and convinced me that Caleb would be happier somewhere designed for kids like him. Jessica revealed more details about our parents' manipulation tactics. They'd told her that my refusal to consider institutional care was selfish, that I was prioritizing my own emotional needs over Caleb's development. They'd convinced her that the pranks were actually therapeutic interventions designed to help Caleb build resilience. They said if I didn't help them gather evidence, you'd never get the support you needed, and Caleb would suffer for the rest of his life. They made me believe I was saving both of you. And the money, I asked. What about Grandpa's inheritance that they've been stealing? Jessica looked genuinely shocked. What inheritance? I showed her copies of the financial documents I'd photographed, explaining how our parents had forged my signature and stolen $50,000 that our grandfather had left to me. Jessica's expression grew more horrified as she realized the scope of their deception. Harper, I swear I didn't know about the money. They told me they were helping me with my expenses out of their savings account. I had no idea they were stealing from you. She pulled out her own phone and started showing me text messages between her and our parents that I hadn't seen before. Messages where Carol and David promised her a share of family resources if she helped them do what's best for Caleb. Messages where they threatened to cut off her financial support and kick her out of their house if she didn't cooperate with their plan. They said if I refused to help them, I'd be responsible for ruining Caleb's future, Jessica said through her tears. They made me believe that questioning their plan meant I didn't really care about him. I realized that Jessica had been as manipulated as I was, just in a different way. Our parents had used her financial desperation to control her behavior the same way they'd used my love for Caleb to control mine. Jessica, they've been filing false reports with social services. They're trying to have Caleb taken away from me so they can become his legal guardians and control his disability benefits. Jessica stared at me in horror. No, they said they just wanted to get you support services. They said they wanted to help you qualify for assistance programs. I explained the full scope of what Emma had discovered: the fraudulent inheritance paperwork, the systematic social services complaints, the research into guardianship procedures, and residential facilities. Jessica listened with growing shock as she realized she'd been used as a pawn in a much larger criminal scheme. "What can I do?" she asked finally. "How can I fix this?" I looked at my sister, who suddenly seemed much younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Despite everything she'd done to hurt Caleb, I could see that she genuinely hadn't understood the true nature of our parents' plan. "You can tell the truth," I said. "You can testify about how they manipulated you and coerced you into hurting Caleb. You can help me protect him from them." Jessica nodded immediately. "Yes, whatever you need. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." She agreed to provide written testimony about our parents' manipulation tactics, surrender all the text messages and financial records she had, and cooperate fully with the criminal investigation. In exchange, Emma would try to negotiate immunity for her role in the conspiracy. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Jessica grabbed my arm. "Harper, I'm so sorry. I know I can't undo what I did to Caleb, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt him. I thought I was helping." Looking at my sister, I realized that our parents' most insidious crime wasn't the financial fraud or even the child abuse. It was the way they'd turned family members against each other by manipulating our love and trust. They'd used Jessica's desperation and my devotion to create a situation where we were hurting the people we cared about most. But now that we understood their tactics, we could fight back together. Armed with Jessica's cooperation, I felt ready to confront our parents directly. Emma had provided me with a high-quality recording device, and Jessica had agreed to help create a situation where Carol and David would speak freely about their plans. We needed them to admit their true motivations on tape to strengthen our criminal case. I visited my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, telling them I was ready to discuss their suggestions about getting help with Caleb. I brought him with me but asked Jessica to keep him entertained in the backyard while I talked to Carol and David privately. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told them as we sat in their living room. "Maybe you're right that I'm in over my head." Carol leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you're finally being realistic about this situation." David set down his newspaper and gave me his full attention. "What changed your mind?" "The medical bills are getting so expensive and Caleb's having more meltdowns lately," I said, repeating the concerns I'd expressed during my previous visit. "I don't know how to help him anymore." My mother's eyes lit up with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "We've been trying to tell you for months that this isn't sustainable. You're doing the best you can, but some situations require professional intervention." "Show me those papers you mentioned," I said, positioning my purse where the recording device would pick up their voices clearly. "The guardianship documents." David immediately went to his office and returned with a folder full of legal paperwork. As he spread the documents across the coffee table, he began explaining their plan with an enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. "These forms would transfer legal guardianship of Caleb to your mother and me temporarily, just until he can be placed in an appropriate residential facility. You'd still be his mother, of course, but we'd handle all the legal and financial responsibilities." "What kind of financial responsibilities?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Carol jumped in eagerly. "Honey, there's so much government assistance available for families dealing with autism, but you have to know how to navigate the system. We've been researching the programs, and Caleb could qualify for substantial monthly benefits." "How substantial?" David pulled out a calculator and started showing me figures. Between Social Security disability state assistance, Medicaid coverage, and residential care funding, we're looking at approximately $4,000 per month in combined benefits. I felt sick listening to them discuss my son like a financial investment, but I forced myself to sound interested. "That seems like a lot of money." "It is," Carol said. "And honestly, Harper, you've never been good with finances. Remember how you struggled with student loans? We'd make sure every penny goes toward Caleb's care and your future stability." "My future stability?" Carol moved closer and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Sweetheart, you're 32 years old. You could still meet someone and have a normal family, but not with Caleb's constant needs holding you back." David nodded approvingly. "The residential facilities we're looking at are excellent. Caleb would get professional care around the clock, and you could visit whenever you want. You'd have your life back." I realized they were describing their perfect scenario. Caleb institutionalized, but generating income they could control me, isolated and financially dependent on them and themselves, in complete legal control of both our lives. "But what if I change my mind later?" I asked. "What if I decide I want to care for Caleb myself again?" There was a long pause. Carol and David exchanged a look that made me understand I'd asked the wrong question. "Harper," my mother said finally, "once Caleb is in professional care and you've rebuilt your life, I don't think you'll want to go backward. You'll see how much better things can be when you're not constantly stressed about his needs." David was more direct. "The legal arrangements would be permanent. Guardianship transfers aren't temporary decisions." I felt like I was staring at strangers. These people who I'd called mom and dad for 32 years were calmly explaining how they planned to take my son away from me forever, while convincing me it was for my own good. "Can I ask you something?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you actually care about Caleb, or is this all about the money?" Another pause, another exchange of looks. "Of course we care about Caleb. Carol said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We want what's best for him." "But you have to be realistic," David added. "That boy is never going to have a normal life. He's never going to be independent. He's never going to contribute anything meaningful to society. At least this way, his disability can provide some benefit to the family." The words hung in the air like poison. I stared at my father, who had just described my beautiful, intelligent, loving son as worthless except for his monetary value. "What about me?" I asked quietly. "Do you care about me?" Carol reached over and patted my hand with artificial sympathy. "Honestly, sweetheart, we never thought you'd be a good mother anyway. You were always too emotional, too impulsive. We were worried when you got pregnant, but we hoped you'd grow into the responsibility. Instead, you had a special needs child that you can't handle properly," David continued. "But that's not entirely your fault. Some people just aren't cut out for parenting, especially challenging situations like autism." I realized they were saying out loud what they'd probably thought about me for years. In their minds, I was incompetent. Caleb was defective, and both of us existed primarily to serve their financial interests. "At least with Caleb's condition, there's finally some benefit to your mistakes," David said casually, as if he was discussing the weather. Carol nodded. "You've always been selfish and impractical, but now you can finally contribute something useful to the family." I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard. My parents had admitted on tape that they viewed both Caleb and me as burdens who could finally serve a purpose by generating income they could control. When I returned to the living room, they were discussing residential facilities they'd already contacted. "We've narrowed it down to 3 options," Carol was telling David. "The one in Phoenix has the lowest monthly fees, which would maximize the benefit differential." "What about visiting policies?" David asked. "Supervised visits twice a month," Carol replied. "Perfect for maintaining the appearance of family involvement without too much actual responsibility." I listened to them plan my son's institutionalization like they were discussing vacation destinations. They had researched facilities based on cost efficiency rather than quality of care, and they'd chosen options that would minimize their obligation to actually visit or maintain relationships with Caleb. As I prepared to leave with my son, my parents made one final push. "Think seriously about what we've discussed today," Carol said, hugging me with an affection that now felt completely revolting. "This is your chance to finally have the life you deserve." David handed me the guardianship papers. "Take these home and review them. We can meet with a lawyer next week to make it official." During the drive home, Caleb asked me why Grandma and Grandpa always made me sad. "They don't make me sad, sweetheart." I told him, though it wasn't entirely true. "Yes, they do," he said with the directness that autism sometimes provided. "You always cry in the car after we see them." I realized that even at 8 years old, Caleb had been aware of the emotional impact these visits had on me. He'd been watching me struggle with my family's manipulation without understanding the full context, but sensing that something was wrong. "You're right," I admitted. "Sometimes grown-ups don't treat each other very nicely, and that makes me sad." "Are we going to keep seeing them?" he asked. I looked at my son in the rearview mirror, so serious and thoughtful, and realized I finally had a clear answer. "Not anymore, baby. We're done with people who don't treat us with kindness." That night, I reviewed the recordings with Emma. We had everything we needed to file criminal charges and protect Caleb from further harm. My parents had condemned themselves with their own words, revealing motivations so callous and manipulative that no jury would sympathize with them. But more importantly, I finally understood that the family I'd been trying to preserve never actually existed. The people who had raised me were capable of viewing their grandchild as a source of income, rather than a human being deserving of love and protection. I was ready to build a real family for Caleb, one based on genuine care, rather than manipulation and control. Emma called me the following Monday morning with news that would change everything about our case. "Harper, I need you to come to my office this afternoon. I've been contacted by the State Attorney General's office, and there are some developments you need to know about immediately." Her tone was serious but excited, which confused me. Is that good news or bad news? It's complicated, but I think it's very good news for you and Caleb. When I arrived at Emma's office that afternoon, I was surprised to find 2 additional people waiting with her. A woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Assistant Attorney General Linda Chen, and a man who handed me a badge identifying him as Detective Mike Rodriguez from the State Fraud Investigation Unit. Mrs. Harper. Assistant Attorney General Chen began, "Your case has come to our attention as part of a larger investigation we've been conducting into disability benefit fraud and elder financial abuse. Your evidence suggests that your parents may be part of a pattern of criminal activity that extends well beyond your immediate family." Detective Rodriguez opened a file folder and spread several documents across Emma's conference table. "We've been investigating a network of cases involving grandparents who manipulate family situations to gain control over disability benefits, inheritance funds, and guardianship rights. Your parents' names have appeared in connection with 3 other families experiencing similar circumstances." My heart started racing. Other families where grandparents have filed false social services reports, stolen inheritance money, and attempted to gain guardianship of grandchildren with disabilities, Chen explained. "The pattern is remarkably consistent across cases." Detective Rodriguez showed me police reports from other jurisdictions, where Carol and David Harper had been mentioned as concerned family members or character witnesses in guardianship proceedings. In each case, parents of disabled children had suddenly faced financial difficulties, social services investigations, and pressure from extended family to consider residential care options. "We believe your parents have been operating as part of an informal network that shares information about exploiting disability benefit systems," Chen said. "They may have been coaching other grandparents on how to replicate their tactics." Emma leaned forward. "What does this mean for Harper's case?" "It means that instead of prosecuting an isolated family dispute, we're looking at a complex criminal conspiracy that involves multiple victims and potentially federal charges," Chen replied. "We'd like to use Harper's evidence as the foundation for a much larger prosecution." Detective Rodriguez explained that my case was uniquely strong because of the comprehensive documentation I'd gathered. The recordings, photographs, text messages, and financial records provided evidence of criminal intent that was missing from other cases they'd investigated. "Most victims don't realize what's happening until after they've lost custody of their children," he said. "By then, the evidence is much harder to reconstruct. Your proactive approach to documenting their behavior gives us the strongest case we've seen." Assistant Attorney General Chen outlined how the expanded prosecution would work. Instead of local charges filed by Emma, the state would file criminal charges that could include federal conspiracy and fraud violations. This meant that my parents would face much more serious penalties if convicted, but it also meant the case would receive state resources and investigative support. "We'd like to coordinate the arrests with seizure of their assets to prevent them from hiding evidence or transferring money to avoid restitution," Chen said. "We believe they've been operating this scheme for several years and may have substantial hidden assets." Emma asked about the timeline for prosecution and how it would affect my immediate concerns about Caleb's safety. "We can expedite emergency protective orders that would prevent your parents from having any contact with Caleb or filing further reports with social services," Detective Rodriguez explained. "The criminal charges would be filed simultaneously with comprehensive asset freezing to recover your stolen inheritance." I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were describing. My family dispute had become part of a state-level criminal investigation involving multiple agencies and potentially federal charges. "Mrs. Harper," Chen said gently, "I know this is a lot to process, but I want you to understand that your courage in fighting back hasn't just protected your own son. You've helped us identify a criminal enterprise that has been devastating families across multiple counties. Detective Rodriguez showed me photos of other children who had been removed from their parents' care through similar manipulation schemes. Kids who were now in residential facilities while their grandparents collected their disability benefits. Kids who had been separated from loving parents based on fabricated evidence and false social services reports. Your case gives us the evidence we need to reunite those families and hold the perpetrators accountable, he said. Emma reviewed the timeline for moving forward. The state would coordinate arrests, evidence seizure, and asset freezing within the next 72 hours. Emergency protective orders would be filed immediately to prevent my parents from contacting me or Caleb. Criminal charges would be announced publicly, which might encourage other victims to come forward with similar experiences. What about Jessica? I asked. She's agreed to cooperate and provide testimony. Her cooperation will be crucial, Chen said. We'll work out an immunity agreement in exchange for her testimony and evidence. Her willingness to admit her role and provide documentation of their manipulation tactics will strengthen the case significantly. As the meeting concluded, I realized that my decision to fight back had ripple effects I never could have anticipated. Other families would be reunited with their children. Other parents would recover stolen inheritance money. Other victims would see their abusers held accountable. Detective Rodriguez handed me his card and explained the security protocols for the next few days while they prepared for arrests. Mrs. Harper, you should be proud of what you've accomplished. Most people in your situation never find the courage or resources to challenge this kind of systematic abuse. Your persistence has exposed a criminal network that might have continued destroying families for years. That evening, I sat with Caleb while he worked on a puzzle, watching him concentrate with the peaceful focus that had returned since we'd started limiting contact with my parents. He didn't know that within days, the grandparents who had been secretly plotting against him would be in jail. He didn't understand that his mother had been fighting a legal battle to protect him from people who saw him only as a source of income. All he knew was that he felt safer lately and that I seemed less stressed after family visits had stopped. "Mommy, are we going to see Grandma and Grandpa this weekend?" he asked without looking up from his puzzle. "No, sweetheart, we're going to be doing different things on weekends now." "Good," he said simply. "I like weekends better when it's just us." I realized that Caleb had been aware all along that something was wrong with our family dynamics. His autism hadn't made him less perceptive about emotional manipulation. If anything, his direct way of processing information had helped him understand that our family interactions weren't healthy long before I was ready to admit it. As I tucked him into bed that night, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of justice for everything we'd endured, but more importantly, it would bring the beginning of a life free from manipulation abuse and people who saw my son as anything less than the amazing child he was. The state attorney general's office moved quickly to set up what they called a controlled confrontation with my parents. They wanted to catch Carol and David in the act of further manipulating the situation, and they needed me to create an opportunity for them to incriminate themselves one final time. Detective Rodriguez explained the plan during a briefing at Emma's office. "We want you to call your parents and tell them you've decided to move forward with the guardianship arrangements. Tell them you want to meet this weekend to sign the papers and discuss Caleb's transition to residential care." Assistant Attorney General Chen added, "We'll have surveillance teams positioned around their house, and you'll be wearing both audio and video recording equipment. We need them to discuss their financial arrangements and guardianship plans on camera." Emma reviewed the legal protections in place for me and Caleb during this operation. Emergency protective orders were already prepared, and social services had been briefed on the true nature of my family's false reports. If anything went wrong during the confrontation, law enforcement was prepared to intervene immediately. "Are you comfortable with this approach?" Chen asked me. "I know it requires you to pretend to cooperate with people who have been abusing your son." I thought about all the children Detective Rodriguez had shown me, kids who were still separated from their families because my parents' criminal network had never been exposed. I thought about Caleb, who deserved to grow up free from people who saw him as a commodity rather than a beloved child. "I can do it," I told them. "What do you need me to say?" The recording equipment was more sophisticated than I'd expected. A tiny camera was hidden in the button of my jacket, and the audio device was embedded in what looked like an ordinary hair clip. Detective Rodriguez tested both devices to make sure they were capturing clear evidence. "Remember, we need them to discuss the money," he said. "Get them to explain how the disability benefits work, how much they expect to receive, and what they plan to do with the funds." I called my parents Friday evening and delivered the performance of my life. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything you said, and you're right. I can't keep struggling like this. Caleb needs professional care, and I need help managing his situation." Carol's voice immediately brightened with excitement. "Oh, Harper, I'm so relieved you're finally being reasonable about this. Your father and I have been so worried about both of you. Can we meet this weekend to finalize the paperwork? I want to get the process started as soon as possible." "Of course, sweetheart. Come for Sunday dinner and we'll go through everything together. Should we start looking at residential facilities this week?" "Yes," I forced myself to say. "I think that would be best for everyone." Sunday afternoon, I arrived at my parents' house with Caleb, who I'd told was going to play with Jessica in the backyard while I talked business with his grandparents. The surveillance teams were positioned, and I could see Detective Rodriguez's unmarked car parked discreetly down the street. Jessica met us at the door, and I could see the stress in her face as she realized this was the final confrontation that would send our parents to prison. She'd been briefed on her role in keeping Caleb occupied and safe, while I gathered the last pieces of evidence needed for prosecution. "Harper, come sit down," Carol said warmly as Jessica led Caleb outside to the swing set. "Your father has all the paperwork ready." David spread the guardianship documents across the kitchen table with obvious pride. "I've been working with a lawyer to make sure everything is legally binding," he said. "Once you sign these forms, we'll have full authority to make decisions about Caleb's care and placement." "How long does the process take?" I asked, positioning myself where the camera would capture both of them clearly. "The legal transfer can be completed within 2 weeks," Carol said. "We've already contacted the residential facilities we discussed, and there's an opening at the Phoenix location starting next month." I forced myself to sound interested rather than horrified. "Tell me more about how the financial arrangements work." David pulled out his calculator and started explaining their financial projections with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a successful business investment. Caleb's Social Security disability benefits will be approximately $1,200 per month. The state assistance programs add another $800. Medicaid covers all his medical expenses, and the residential facility fees are paid directly by the state program. "So how much actual money do we receive?" I asked. Carol leaned forward conspiratorially. "After the facility fees are paid, we're looking at approximately $1,500 per month in surplus benefits, plus your inheritance money, which we've been managing carefully." "What inheritance money?" "Your grandfather's trust fund," David said casually. $50,000 that we've been investing on your behalf. We thought it was better to let us handle the finances rather than have you spend it impulsively." I felt the camera recording their casual admission of felony inheritance theft, but I forced myself to stay calm and continue gathering evidence. "That seems like a lot of money to manage," I said. "How will you make sure it goes toward Caleb's care?" Another exchange of looks between my parents. Another moment where they revealed their true intentions without realizing they were condemning themselves. "Well, Caleb's care will be covered by the state programs," Carol said slowly. "The additional funds would go toward family expenses related to managing his situation." David was more direct. "Harper, once Caleb is in professional care, you'll need to rebuild your life. That money will help support you while you get back on your feet." "What if I want to visit him regularly?" "The facility allows supervised visits twice a month," Carol said. "But honestly, frequent visits can be disruptive to his adjustment process. The staff recommends letting him settle into his new routine without too much outside interference." I realized they were planning to virtually eliminate my contact with Caleb while maintaining legal and financial control over his life. In their minds, the perfect scenario was my son institutionalized and generating income while being completely cut off from the mother who loved him. "What about Caleb's opinions?" I asked. "What if he doesn't want to live in a residential facility?" David scoffed. "Harper, he's 8 years old and autistic. He doesn't have the cognitive ability to make decisions about his own care. That's why guardianship transfers exist." "He seems happy living with me," I said carefully. "He seems happy because you enable all his behaviors instead of challenging him to grow," Carol replied sharply. "Professional caregivers will help him develop coping skills that you can't provide." I watched my parents dismiss my son's emotional well-being and my parenting abilities with casual cruelty, all while planning to profit financially from separating us permanently. "There's one thing I'm still worried about," I said. "What if he gets upset during the transition?" "That's what the medication is for," David said matter-of-factly. I felt my blood freeze. "What medication?" Carol looked annoyed with David for mentioning something they apparently hadn't planned to discuss. "Just mild sedatives to help him adjust to the new environment. The facility staff are experienced with managing behavioral issues during transitions." "You mean drugging him?" "Harper, you're being dramatic again," David said dismissively. "We're talking about medically supervised treatment to reduce his anxiety. It's completely normal for children with autism who are adjusting to institutional care." I realized that not only were my parents planning to take Caleb away from me, they were planning to chemically restrain him to make him easier to manage in an institution where no one would love him or advocate for his individual needs. The recording equipment was capturing every word as they calmly discussed sedating my child to facilitate their financial scheme. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, excusing myself before I lost control of my emotions and revealed the true purpose of my visit. In the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror and tried to process what I'd just heard. My parents weren't just planning to steal money and separate our family, they were planning to drug my son into compliance so he'd be easier for institutional staff to manage. When I returned to the kitchen, Carol had prepared what she called a celebration dinner to mark my agreement to their guardianship plan. "Jessica, bring Caleb in for dinner," she called toward the backyard. "We're celebrating the start of a new chapter for our family." As we sat around the table, I watched my parents interact with Caleb with artificial affection that now seemed nauseating. They asked him about school and complimented his table manners, all while planning to drug him and lock him away in an institution within weeks. Caleb sensed something was different about the dinner. He kept looking at me with concerned eyes, as if he could tell I was upset, despite my efforts to appear calm. His sensitivity to emotional atmospheres was working against him in this situation, making him aware that something was wrong, without understanding what it was. After dinner, as I prepared to leave with evidence of multiple felonies recorded on state surveillance equipment, my parents made their final pitch. "Harper, you're doing the right thing," Carol said, hugging me with poisonous warmth. "A year from now, you'll look back on this as the moment your real life began." David handed me copies of the guardianship paperwork and financial projections. "Review these this week and let us know if you have questions. We can meet with the lawyer Friday to make everything official." During the drive home, Caleb was unusually quiet. Finally, he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, or Grandma, and Grandpa going to take me away from you?" I realized that despite all our efforts to protect him from the adult conversations, he'd understood exactly what was being discussed. His autism hadn't made him oblivious to the threat to our family. If anything, his direct processing of information had helped him see through the pleasant facade my parents maintained. "No, sweetheart, no one is ever going to take you away from me." "Good," he said with relief. "I don't want to live anywhere else. I want to stay with you forever." That night, I delivered the recording equipment back to Detective Rodriguez and Assistant Attorney General Chen. They reviewed the footage and audio recordings with satisfaction that bordered on amazement. Mrs. Harper, you've just handed us evidence of conspiracy, financial fraud, child endangerment, and planned false imprisonment, Chen said. Your parents have essentially convicted themselves. Detective Rodriguez was already coordinating with arrest teams for the following morning. We'll execute search warrants simultaneously with the arrests to seize their financial records and prevent them from destroying evidence. As I drove home that night, I realized that tomorrow would bring the end of the most traumatic period of my life and the beginning of real freedom for Caleb and me. My parents would face justice for their crimes, other families would be reunited with their children, and my son would grow up safe from people who saw him as anything less than the remarkable child he was. But most importantly, Caleb would never have to worry again about being drugged institutionalized or separated from the mother who would fight any battle to protect him. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually made me feel hopeful, but today it carried the weight of finality. Detective Rodriguez had called at dawn to confirm that arrest warrants had been signed and search teams were in position. By evening, my parents would be in custody, and this nightmare would begin to end. Emma met me at the district attorney's office to review the final details of the confrontation that would happen before the arrests. The plan was for Jessica and me to visit my parents together, present all the evidence we'd gathered, and give them one final opportunity to confess before law enforcement moved in. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked as we walked toward the parking garage. "Once we do this, there's no going back to family dinners and pretending everything is normal." I thought about Caleb, who had slept peacefully through the night for the first time in months, no longer anxious about upcoming visits with his grandparents. There's nothing normal to go back to. They've been planning to drug my son and lock him away while stealing his benefits. That's not a family. That's a criminal enterprise. Jessica was waiting in her car outside my parents' house when Emma and I arrived. She looked pale and nervous, but determined. Over the past week, she'd provided additional evidence that strengthened our case significantly, including financial records showing exactly how my stolen inheritance had been spent on her expenses. "Are you sure you're ready to do this?" I asked her as we walked toward the front door together. "I have to make this right," she said quietly. "I can't live with what I helped them do to Caleb." When my mother opened the door, her face lit up with artificial joy at seeing both her daughters together. "What a wonderful surprise! Come in, come in. Your father is just finishing his coffee." We found David in the living room, surrounded by the financial documents and guardianship papers from yesterday's meeting. He looked up expectantly, probably assuming we were there to finalize the arrangements for taking Caleb away from me. "Girl's perfect timing," he said, gesturing to the papers spread across the coffee table. "I was just reviewing the timeline for Caleb's placement. We should be able to complete the transfer by the end of next week." I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me and claimed to love me, and felt nothing but cold determination. "We're not here to finalize anything, Dad. We're here to give you both a chance to tell the truth before it's too late." Carol's expression shifted from joy to confusion. "What do you mean, truth, about what?" Jessica stepped forward, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Mom, Dad, we know everything. We know about the stolen inheritance, the false social services reports, the plan to drug Caleb and put him in an institution. We have evidence of all of it." The color drained from David's face. "Jessica, what are you talking about? We've been trying to help Harper and Caleb." By forging my signature on legal documents, I asked pulling out copies of the inheritance paperwork. By filing false reports with social services claiming I'm an abusive mother, by researching how much money you could make from Caleb's disability benefits. Carol immediately went on the defensive, her voice rising to the sharp tone I remembered from childhood arguments. "Harper, you're being paranoid and dramatic as usual. Everything we've done has been to help you manage a situation you clearly can't handle. Help me by stealing $50,000 from Grandpa's will. Help me by planning to have my son sedated in a residential facility while you collect his benefits." David stood up abruptly, his face flushing red with anger. "Now you listen to me, young lady. We have sacrificed for years to support you and that boy. We've put up with his tantrums, his special needs, his constant demands for accommodation. If there's finally a way for this family to benefit from all the trouble he's caused, we're going to take it." The mask was completely off now. David was revealing the contempt he'd felt for Caleb all along, the resentment he'd hidden behind fake, grandparental concern. "Caleb isn't trouble," I said firmly. "He's an 8-year-old child who deserves to be loved and protected, not exploited for financial gain." "He's a burden." Carol snapped, her artificial sweetness replaced by vicious honesty. "He's always been a burden, and you've been too selfish to admit it. At least our plan gives him professional care while providing some compensation for what this family has endured." Jessica gasped at our mother's cruelty, but I felt strangely calm. This was who they really were, and hearing them say it out loud was almost liberating. "What about the text messages where you plan to trigger his autism symptoms?" I asked. "Was that professional care too?" "We were trying to show you reality," David said, his agitation increasing. "You baby him and enable behaviors that make him impossible to manage. Someone had to demonstrate how disruptive he really is." I pulled out my phone and started reading directly from their group chat messages. Maybe if we push him hard enough, he'll snap out of this autism nonsense. Hide his noise-canceling headphones and force him to deal with normal sound levels. Good job with the perfume. Maybe Harper will finally see how much trouble he is. Carol's face twisted with anger rather than shame. "We were trying to help you accept reality about his limitations. You live in a fantasy world where you pretend he's going to have a normal life." "His life is normal for him," I said, "and it's beautiful and meaningful, even if you're too narrow-minded to see it." David's face was getting redder by the minute as he realized how much evidence we had against them. "You ungrateful little bitch. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us, by accusing us of crimes." "By protecting my son from people who see him as a source of income rather than a human being," I corrected. Jessica found her voice again stronger this time. "Mom, Dad, you manipulated me into hurting a child. You threatened to make me homeless if I didn't help you abuse my nephew. How is that family loyalty?" Carol turned on Jessica with vicious intensity. "You were pathetic and desperate, Jessica. Your divorce left you with nothing. No skills, no prospects, no value to anyone. We gave you purpose and support, and this is how you thank us." The contempt in my mother's voice was breathtaking. She was revealing that she viewed Jessica the same way she viewed Caleb and me, as burdens who existed primarily to serve her needs and generate benefits for her comfort. "We should call the police," Jessica said, reaching for her phone. "The police are already involved," I said quietly. "Criminal charges have been filed. Arrest warrants have been issued. You're both going to prison for conspiracy, fraud, child abuse, and theft." David's face went from red to purple. He started clutching his chest, breathing heavily, as the reality of the situation hit him. "You're lying," Carol said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're making this up to scare us." I pulled out copies of the criminal charges that Assistant Attorney General Chen had provided: conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, filing false reports with government agencies, child endangerment, financial exploitation of a disabled minor. The State Attorney General is prosecuting this as part of a larger investigation into disability benefit fraud. David collapsed back into his chair, still clutching his chest. His breathing was becoming labored and sweat was beading on his forehead. "Dad, are you okay?" Jessica asked, moving toward him with concern. "Don't you dare pretend to care about him now," Carol screamed at Jessica. "This is your fault. You betrayed your own family." David's breathing grew more shallow, and I realized he was having some kind of medical emergency. Despite everything he'd done, I found myself calling 911, while Carol continued raging at Jessica and me. "You've destroyed this family," Carol shouted as EMT sirens approached in the distance. "Your father is having a heart attack because of your vindictive lies, Harper. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied that you've destroyed the people who raised you?" I stared at my mother, who was blaming me for my father's heart attack instead of acknowledging the stress caused by his own criminal behavior. Even in the face of medical emergency and criminal prosecution, she was incapable of taking responsibility for the consequences of their actions. The EMTs arrived and immediately began treating David, who was conscious but showing signs of cardiac distress. As they prepared to transport him to the hospital, Carol grabbed my arm with desperate intensity. "Harper, we can work this out. Family should forgive family. Don't let them arrest your own parents over a misunderstanding." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then directly into her eyes. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mom. It was child abuse and felony theft. And I'm done protecting people who hurt my son." As the ambulance pulled away with David inside, Detective Rodriguez appeared at the front door with several uniformed officers. "Mrs. Carol Harper, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, child endangerment, and filing false reports with government agencies. You have the right to remain silent." Carol's last words before they put her in the police car were directed at me. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life, Harper. Family is supposed to forgive and forget." But standing there watching my mother being arrested for trying to steal my son and destroy our lives, I felt nothing but relief. This wasn't family. This was abuse, masquerading as love, and it was finally over. David survived his heart attack, but he was arrested in his hospital bed the following morning. I wasn't there to see it, but Detective Rodriguez called to update me on how it went. "He tried to claim the stress of your false accusations caused his medical emergency," Rodriguez said. "His lawyer was arguing that the charges should be dropped on compassionate grounds." "What did you tell them?" "That heart attacks don't invalidate criminal evidence and that stress from being caught committing crimes isn't a legal defense. David was stable enough to be released from the hospital within 3 days, but instead of going home, he was transferred directly to county jail where he'd wait for his trial. The judge had denied bail, citing flight risk and the serious nature of the charges. Carol, meanwhile, had surprised everyone by posting bail within hours of her arrest. Emma had warned me this might happen since the financial fraud charges made her eligible for bail, even though the child endangerment charges were more serious. "She's probably going to try to contact you," Emma told me during our meeting that afternoon. "Don't take her calls, don't respond to letters, don't engage with her at all. Anything she says could be used to manipulate the legal proceedings." But Carol didn't try to contact me. Instead, she disappeared. The first sign that something was wrong came when Detective Rodriguez called me on Friday evening. "Mrs. Harper, we have a problem. Your mother didn't report for her scheduled check-in with her bail officer today. When we sent someone to her house, it was empty. She appears to have fled." My heart sank. What does that mean for the case? It means she's now facing additional charges for bail jumping, and it means we need to find her before she leaves the state or destroys more evidence. Emma explained that Carol's flight actually strengthened our case in some ways since it demonstrated consciousness of guilt, but it also meant she might be trying to hide assets or contact other victims to intimidate them before they could testify. "Do you have any idea where she might go?" Rodriguez asked. I thought about my mother's habits, her friends, her usual behavior when she felt cornered. "She's probably with Jessica," I said suddenly. Carol always turns to Jessica when she needs something. But when Rodriguez called Jessica, she seemed genuinely shocked by the news of Carol's disappearance. "She hasn't contacted me," Jessica said. "After what happened at their house, I assumed she'd never speak to me again. If she does contact you, it's crucial that you call us immediately," Rodriguez told Jessica. "Don't meet with her alone, don't agree to help her, and don't let her convince you that cooperation with law enforcement was a mistake." Saturday morning, Jessica called me in tears. "Harper, she wants me to drive her to Canada. She says if we can just get across the border, she can explain everything and prove that you've been lying about the family." My blood ran cold. "Please tell me you said no." "Of course I said no. But Harper, she's completely delusional. She really believes that she was helping Caleb and that you've brainwashed everyone against her. She can't accept that what she did was wrong." Jessica explained that Carol had called her from a truck stop outside the city, claiming that the criminal charges were based on Harper's lies, and that fleeing the country was the only way to avoid being railroaded by a corrupt legal system. She offered me $10,000 to drive her to Montreal, Jessica said. She said once we got there, she could access bank accounts that would prove she was managing family money responsibly. I realized that even facing criminal prosecution, Carol was still trying to manipulate Jessica through financial pressure. She was still operating under the assumption that money could solve any problem and that family loyalty could override legal obligations. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I would meet her to talk about it. But Harper, I'm going to call Detective Rodriguez and set up a sting operation. She needs to be caught before she disappears completely." Within 2 hours, Jessica was wearing a wire and driving to the truck stop where Carol was waiting. Detective Rodriguez and several state patrol officers were positioned around the location, ready to move in once Carol incriminated herself further. I waited at Emma's office while the operation played out, listening to the radio communications between the surveillance teams. Jessica's wire was transmitting clearly, and we could hear every word of her conversation with Carol. "Thank God you came," Carol said when Jessica arrived. "I knew you'd come to your senses and remember what family loyalty means." "Mom, I'm scared," Jessica replied, following the script we'd rehearsed. "Are you sure running away is the right thing to do?" "It's the only thing to do. Harper has poisoned everyone against me with her lies. She's convinced the police that I was trying to hurt Caleb when everything I did was to help that boy get the care he needs." Even while fleeing prosecution for child abuse, Carol was maintaining the fiction that her actions had been motivated by concern for Caleb's welfare. "What about Dad?" Jessica asked. "What about his heart attack?" "Your father is in jail because Harper wanted revenge," Carol said bitterly. "She's always been vindictive and selfish, but I never thought she'd destroy her own parents to get what she wants." I listened to my mother blame me for the consequences of her own criminal behavior, and I felt a strange sense of peace. This was who she really was. This was how she processed responsibility and accountability. There was no reasoning with someone who was fundamentally incapable of acknowledging wrongdoing. "Mom, what if Harper was telling the truth?" Jessica asked carefully. "What if we really did hurt Caleb?" "Jessica, don't let her brainwashing affect you, too. That boy needed structure and discipline. He needed to learn how to function in the real world instead of being babied and enabled. We were doing him a favor." Carol went on to describe her plans for fleeing to Canada, accessing hidden bank accounts, and eventually moving to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. She'd been planning this escape route for months, probably anticipating that her criminal activities would eventually be discovered. "I have money set aside in accounts that Harper doesn't know about," Carol said. "Money from your grandfather's estate that I've been managing properly. Once we get across the border, we'll have the resources to start over somewhere they can't touch us." She was admitting to additional financial crimes on tape, while also revealing that she'd been planning to flee prosecution long before her arrest. "What about Caleb?" Jessica asked. "Don't you want to see him grow up?" "That boy is never going to grow up normally," Carol replied with casual cruelty. "He's always going to be a burden on whatever family takes care of him. At least, if we'd succeeded with our plan, he would have provided some benefit to compensate for all the trouble he causes." The surveillance team moved in as Carol finished explaining how she viewed my son as a burden, whose only value was the disability benefits he could generate. She was arrested while still talking about her plans to flee the country and her belief that abusing Caleb had been justified. When Detective Rodriguez called to tell me Carol was back in custody, I felt a relief so profound that I started crying in Emma's office. "She's being charged with additional crimes now," he said. "Bail jumping attempted flight to avoid prosecution and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Between the original charges and the new ones, she's looking at significant prison time." Emma handed me tissues and explained how Carol's attempted flight would affect the legal proceedings. "Her behavior demonstrates that she's a danger to the community and a flight risk," Emma said. "The judge will almost certainly deny bail this time, which means she'll stay in jail until trial." That evening, I sat with Caleb while he worked on his homework, both of us enjoying the peaceful quiet of our house. No more phone calls from manipulative grandparents. No more anxiety about upcoming family visits. No more worrying that someone was plotting to take him away from me. "Mommy, are the bad people gone now?" he asked without looking up from his math worksheet. I realized he'd understood more about our situation than I'd given him credit for. His autism hadn't made him oblivious to the threat our family posed. If anything, his direct way of processing information had helped him recognize danger that I'd been trained to ignore. "Yes, sweetheart, the bad people are gone now. It's just you and me and people who really love us." "Good," he said simply. "I like it better this way." So did I. 3 weeks later, Emma called with news that would change our financial situation completely. "Harper, you need to come to my office immediately. We've been going through your parents' seized financial records, and there's something you need to know about your grandfather's estate." When I arrived, Emma had spreadsheets and legal documents covering every surface of her conference table. Assistant Attorney General Chen was there too, along with a forensic accountant who'd been analyzing my parents' financial crimes. "Your grandfather's will was much more complex than your parents let you know," the accountant began. "The $50,000 they stole was only the first installment of a much larger inheritance." Chen opened a file folder and showed me documents I'd never seen before. "Your grandfather established a trust fund that was supposed to release money to you in stages. $50,000 at age 30, another $75,000 at age 35, and the remainder when you turned 40. I stared at the paperwork, trying to process what they were telling me. "How much money are we talking about?" "The total value of your inheritance, including property and investments your parents never told you about, is approximately $215,000. My legs felt weak. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the scope of my parents' deception. "There's more," Emma said gently. "Your grandfather also purchased a house in Michigan specifically for you and Caleb. It's been sitting vacant for 2 years while your parents paid the property taxes and maintenance costs to keep it from being discovered." The forensic accountant showed me photographs of a beautiful 3-bedroom house on 5 acres of land near Grand Rapids. It had been purchased with instructions that it should be transferred to me when I was ready to build a stable home for future generations. "Your parents have been using your inheritance money to maintain this property while hiding its existence from you," Chen explained. "They've spent approximately $30,000 of your money on taxes, utilities, and upkeep for a house they never intended to tell you about." Emma pulled out additional documents showing how my stolen inheritance had been spent. Beyond Jessica's support payments, Carol and David had used my money for luxury purchases, vacation travel, and investments in their own names. "The good news is that we can recover almost everything," the accountant said. "The house is in excellent condition, the investments have actually grown in value, and we've identified bank accounts where most of the liquid assets are being held." Chen explained the legal process for asset recovery. Because this was criminal theft, the court can order full restitution plus penalties. Your parents will be required to transfer all stolen assets back to you, including any profits or appreciation that occurred while they held your money illegally. I thought about all the times my parents had implied that I was financially irresponsible, all the times they'd suggested that I couldn't afford to give Caleb the care he needed, all the times they'd made me feel like a burden on the family budget. Meanwhile, they'd been sitting on $250,000 that rightfully belonged to me and my son. "There's something else," Emma said. "Detective Rodriguez has discovered that your case has encouraged 3 other families to come forward with similar experiences. Your parents may have been operating this fraud scheme for years." Chen showed me police reports from other jurisdictions where families had lost custody of disabled children under suspicious circumstances. In each case concerned, grandparents had filed social services, complaints offered guardianship solutions, and ultimately gained control of disability benefits and inheritance money. "Your courage in fighting back has exposed a criminal network that was destroying families across multiple counties," Chen said. "The other victims are now working with law enforcement to recover their children and their stolen assets." I felt overwhelmed by the realization that my decision to protect Caleb had ripple effects far beyond my own family. Other parents would be reunited with their children. Other families would recover stolen inheritance money. Other victims would see their abusers held accountable. Detective Rodriguez joined our meeting to update me on the progress of the criminal prosecution. Both your parents have been offered plea deals, but they're refusing to accept responsibility, he said. Your mother maintains that everything she did was justified, and your father claims he was only trying to help you manage finances you couldn't handle properly. What does that mean for the trial timeline? It means they're going to trial, which will take longer but ultimately result in harsher sentences if they're convicted, Chen explained. Defendants who refuse to show remorse or accept responsibility typically receive maximum penalties. Emma walked me through the financial planning we'd need to do for the recovered inheritance. With nearly $250,000 and a debt-free house, I could afford to complete my college degree, establish a proper special needs trust for Caleb, and build the stable future my grandfather had envisioned for us. The ironic thing is that your parents' crimes have actually secured Caleb's financial future, Emma said. If they hadn't stolen your inheritance and created this legal case, you might never have discovered the full extent of what your grandfather left for you. That evening, I sat in my small rental house with Caleb looking at photographs of the beautiful property in Michigan that would soon be ours. 3 bedrooms, a large yard for him to play in, and enough space for him to have the sensory-friendly environment he needed to thrive. "Mommy, is that our new house?" he asked, studying the photos with intense interest. "It might be, sweetheart. Would you like to live in a place with a big yard and lots of room to explore?" His face lit up with excitement. Could I have a garden? Could I grow vegetables and flowers? I looked at my son, whose dreams were so simple and beautiful, and realized that my grandfather's gift wasn't just about money. It was about giving Caleb the space and security to become whoever he was meant to be, without interference from people who saw him as a burden rather than a blessing. "Yes, baby, you can have the biggest garden you want." As I tucked Caleb into bed that night, I reflected on the journey from victim to survivor to victory. 6 months ago, I'd been a confused single mother who thought she was overreacting to family dynamics she didn't understand. Tonight, I was a woman who had exposed a criminal conspiracy, protected her child from abuse, and secured his financial future. But most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to tolerate the unacceptable, even when it comes from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. My parents had taught me an invaluable lesson: blood doesn't make family. Love, respect, and protection make family. And Caleb and I were building exactly the kind of family he deserved. The news of my parents' arrests spread through our extended family faster than I expected. Within a week of the story being covered in local newspapers, I started receiving phone calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The first call came from my father's sister, Aunt Linda, who lived in Oregon. "Harper, honey, I had no idea what Carol and David were doing to you and Caleb. I'm so sorry we weren't there to help you." She explained that my parents had been telling extended family members that I was struggling with depression and making poor decisions about Caleb's care. They'd convinced everyone that I was too proud to accept help, and that direct contact would only upset me further. "They told us you'd asked for space to work through your problems," Linda said. "They said you didn't want family interference while you were getting therapy. We believed them because they seemed so concerned about your well-being." Over the following days, I learned the extent of my parents' manipulation throughout our extended family. They'd systematically isolated me by telling relatives that I was emotionally unstable and didn't want contact. Meanwhile, they'd positioned themselves as the responsible family members who were managing a difficult situation with grace and discretion. My cousin Rachel called to tell me that Carol had borrowed $15,000 from her last year, claiming it was for Caleb's medical expenses. She showed me bills and doctor reports. "Harper, she said you were too overwhelmed to handle the insurance paperwork properly and that medical providers were threatening to stop treating Caleb." I realized that my mother had been using my son's autism as a fundraising tool throughout our extended family, collecting money under false pretenses while portraying me as an incompetent parent. She never asked me for help with medical bills, I told Rachel. Caleb's insurance covers everything and I've never had problems with medical providers. Rachel was horrified. Harper, she had detailed documentation, medical reports, insurance denials, billing statements. If those were fake, Emma helped me track the money trail through our extended family. Carol had borrowed or solicited donations from 6 different relatives over the past 2 years, always claiming emergency medical needs for Caleb that didn't actually exist. She created an entire fictional narrative about your son's medical situation, Emma explained. She was essentially running a charity fraud scheme using family sympathy for disabled children. The stolen money totaled nearly $40,000 from relatives who genuinely wanted to help Caleb, but had been manipulated into funding Carol's lifestyle instead. My Uncle Jim called to apologize for believing Carol's lies about my mental health. She told us you were having paranoid episodes and imagining threats that didn't exist, he said. She said you'd become convinced that family members were plotting against you when they were actually trying to help. I realized that my mother had been preemptively discrediting any complaints I might make about their behavior. If I'd tried to tell extended family about the abuse, they would have dismissed my concerns as evidence of the mental instability Carol had been describing for months. She showed us text messages where you supposedly sounded confused and angry, Jim continued. But now I'm wondering if those were fake too. Detective Rodriguez confirmed that fabricating text messages and documents was consistent with the level of manipulation my parents had demonstrated throughout their scheme. Your mother is what we call a sophisticated manipulator, he explained. She created false evidence to support her narratives, researched legal and medical terminology to sound credible, and studied psychology tactics to maintain control over multiple victims simultaneously. The most heartbreaking call came from my grandmother's sister, Aunt Margaret, who was 87 years old and living in an assisted living facility. "Harper, dear, I've been so worried about you," she said in her frail voice. "Carol told me you were having financial troubles and couldn't afford to visit or call. She said you were embarrassed about Caleb's condition and didn't want extended family to see how difficult things had become." Aunt Margaret revealed that she'd been sending Carol $500 every month for Harper and Caleb's expenses, money that was supposed to help with groceries, utilities, and Caleb's special needs supplies had been going directly into my mother's bank account. "I wanted to help that precious boy," Margaret said through tears. "I remember how sweet he was when you brought him to visit me at Christmas 3 years ago. Carol said he needed special equipment and therapies that weren't covered by insurance." I calculated that Aunt Margaret had sent over $18,000 of her limited retirement income to my mother, believing she was helping her great-grandnephew access necessary medical care. Aunt Margaret Caleb doesn't need expensive equipment or private therapies. He's doing beautifully with the resources we have. None of that money ever reached us. The scope of my mother's deception throughout our extended family was staggering. She'd turned my son's autism into a fundraising tool while simultaneously portraying me as an unstable parent who couldn't be trusted with direct support. But as painful as these discoveries were, they also brought unexpected healing. Extended family members who had been kept away from us by Carol's lies began reaching out to rebuild genuine relationships. My cousin Tom, who lived nearby but hadn't contacted me in 2 years, asked if he could meet Caleb and take us out for dinner. "I want to see for myself how you're both doing," he said. "Carol painted such a dire picture, but talking to you now, you sound completely competent and stable. I'm starting to think everything she told us was designed to keep us away." When Tom met Caleb, he was amazed by my son's intelligence, humor, and social skills. "Harper, this kid is delightful," Tom said after spending an afternoon at the park with us. "He's funny, he's smart, he's affectionate. Nothing like the picture Carol painted of a severely disabled child who was overwhelming your ability to cope." Through Tom, I learned that my parents had been describing Caleb as much more impaired than he actually was, probably to justify their plans for institutional care, and to generate more sympathy donations from concerned relatives. They made it sound like he couldn't communicate, couldn't learn, couldn't form relationships, Tom said. But he just spent 20 minutes explaining to me how plants grow, and he remembered details about my job that I mentioned when we first met today. As word spread through our extended family about the truth of our situation, I began receiving offers of genuine support. Relatives wanted to contribute to legal fees, help with moving expenses for our new house in Michigan, and establish college savings accounts for Caleb. But more importantly, they wanted to be part of our lives in authentic ways. They wanted to attend Caleb's school programs, celebrate his achievements, and build the kind of loving extended family relationships my parents had systematically destroyed through their manipulation. My Uncle Jim offered to help us move to Michigan when the inheritance property became available. "I have a truck and vacation time," he said. "It would be an honor to help you and Caleb start fresh somewhere that doesn't carry all these painful memories." Aunt Linda began sending Caleb books and educational materials related to his interests in science and nature. "I should have been doing this all along," she said. "I should have questioned why Carol was acting as an intermediary instead of supporting you directly." As our extended family relationships began healing, I realized that one of my parents' cruelest crimes had been stealing years of love and connection that Caleb should have experienced with relatives who genuinely cared about him. But it wasn't too late. He was still young enough to build meaningful relationships with family members who saw him as the remarkable child he was, rather than a burden to be managed or a resource to be exploited. For the first time in years, I felt like Caleb and I were part of a real family, people who showed love through actions rather than manipulation, who offered support without expecting control in return, and who celebrated Caleb's uniqueness rather than trying to change or hide it. The house in Michigan was even more beautiful than the photographs had suggested. When Emma and I drove up for the first inspection, I stood in the driveway looking at the 3-bedroom ranch home surrounded by mature oak trees and felt like I was seeing Caleb's future spread out in front of us. "Your grandfather had excellent taste," Emma said, reviewing the property documents. "This place is perfectly situated for privacy and accessibility. The school district has an outstanding special education program, and you're close enough to Grand Rapids for cultural activities, but far enough out to have real countryside." The interior of the house was immaculate, thanks to the property management company my parents had hired with my stolen inheritance money. Hardwood floors throughout the main living areas, a kitchen with modern appliances and plenty of counter space, and a master bedroom with French doors opening onto a deck that overlooked the back acreage. But it was Caleb's reaction during our second visit that convinced me this was where we needed to build our new life. "Mommy, look," he called from the backyard where he'd discovered a small creek running along the edge of the property. "There are minnows and tadpoles. Can we build a pond for them?" I watched my son explore the natural environment with wonder and excitement, no longer the anxious child who flinched when adults approached too quickly. The constant stress of family visits and hidden manipulation had lifted from his shoulders, and his natural curiosity was flourishing again. "We can build whatever you want, sweetheart," I told him, meaning every word. The move happened faster than I'd expected. Uncle Jim kept his promise to help with the physical relocation, recruiting 2 of his sons to assist with loading and driving the moving truck. Aunt Linda flew in from Oregon to help me pack and organize, and Cousin Rachel offered to coordinate utility transfers and address changes. "This is what real family looks like," Linda said as we wrapped dishes in the kitchen of my old rental house. "People showing up when you need help, not when they want to control you." For the first time in years, I felt supported rather than manipulated by family involvement. No hidden agendas, no strings attached, no expectations that I surrender my autonomy in exchange for assistance. Caleb adapted to the move with the resilience that often surprises people who don't understand autism. As long as his routine objects and comfort items made the transition with him, he was able to embrace the adventure of a new environment. "I like my new room," he announced on our first night in the Michigan house. "It's quiet and I can see the stars from my window. I enrolled Caleb in the local elementary school where the special education coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, was immediately impressed by his academic abilities and social skills. Mrs. Harper, I have to say Caleb seems remarkably well adjusted for a child who's been through such trauma, she said during our orientation meeting. Whatever therapeutic support you've provided has been very effective. I realized that Mrs. Patterson was seeing the real Caleb, the child who had always existed underneath the anxiety and stress caused by my family's systematic abuse. Without people deliberately triggering his sensitivities and undermining his coping mechanisms, his natural intelligence and sweet personality were able to shine. He's had some difficult experiences with extended family, I explained, but we're building a much healthier support system now. The school district offered resources I'd never known, existed sensory breaks integrated into the regular classroom routine assistive technology for students who needed alternative communication methods and social skills groups that help children with autism develop friendships naturally. We believe in supporting students within the general education environment whenever possible, Mrs. Patterson explained. Caleb's academic abilities are at grade level or above in most areas. There's no reason he can't succeed in a mainstream classroom with appropriate accommodations. For the first time since starting school, Caleb came home excited about his day, rather than exhausted by overstimulation and social stress. We're learning about ecosystems, he told me enthusiastically. Did you know that every living thing in a habitat depends on every other living thing? It's like a big family where everyone has an important job. I started classes at the local community college working toward completing the bachelor's degree I'd abandoned when Caleb was born. With the financial security provided by my recovered inheritance, I could afford to study part-time while still being available for Caleb's needs. My sociology professor, Dr. Martinez, was interested in my experience with family manipulation and fraud. Have you considered writing about what you've been through? She asked after I submitted a research paper on financial abuse within family systems. Your first-hand experience could help other parents recognize warning signs and find resources to protect themselves. I began volunteering with a local organization that provided support to families dealing with child abuse and custody disputes. My experience with documenting evidence and navigating the legal system proved valuable in helping other parents who felt overwhelmed by bureaucratic processes. You saved my life, one mother told me after I helped her organize evidence of her ex-husband's psychological abuse. I thought I was going crazy until you showed me how to document everything systematically. 6 months after moving to Michigan, I received the phone call I'd been waiting for from Emma. Harper, the trial is over. Both your parents have been convicted on all charges. Carol received a sentence of 3 years in prison with restitution ordered for all stolen inheritance money and family donations. David received 2 years and was required to undergo psychological evaluation as a condition of his eventual parole. The judge was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, Emma told me. She said that exploiting a disabled child for financial gain while psychologically manipulating his mother represented a level of callousness that warranted the maximum penalties allowed by law. But it was Caleb's reaction to the news that truly marked our transition from victims to survivors. "Mommy does this mean the bad people can't hurt us anymore?" he asked when I explained that his grandparents wouldn't be bothering our family again. "That's exactly what it means, sweetheart. We're safe now and we can build whatever kind of life we want." He thought about this for a moment, then smiled with the pure joy that had returned to his face since we'd moved away from the people who saw him as a burden. "I want to build a life where I can take care of animals and help them feel safe too," he said, "like we do for each other." Looking at my son, who had survived deliberate abuse and systematic attempts to undermine his confidence, I realized that he'd emerged from our ordeal with an even stronger sense of empathy and purpose than before. He wasn't damaged by what we'd been through. He was strengthened by the experience of overcoming it together. "That sounds like a beautiful life to build," I told him. "Let's start planning it." The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp November morning, almost exactly 1 year after the Perfume incident that had started this entire journey. Emma and I sat in the gallery of the courthouse while my parents were brought in wearing orange jumpsuits and handcuffs. Looking at Carol and David, I felt neither satisfaction nor anger. They looked older, smaller, diminished by the consequences of their own choices. What I felt was something closer to pity, mixed with relief that they would never again have the power to hurt my son. Judge Martinez addressed my parents directly before announcing their sentences. Mr. and Mrs. Harper, you have been convicted of conspiracy fraud, child endangerment, and financial exploitation of a disabled minor. These crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the most sacred duties of family to protect and nurture the most vulnerable among us. She continued, instead of providing love and support to your grandson, you saw him as an opportunity for financial gain. Instead of helping your daughter navigate the challenges of single parenthood, you systematically undermined her confidence and abilities. You transformed what should have been a source of strength and comfort into an instrument of manipulation and abuse. Carol was sentenced to 3 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 18 months if she completed psychological counseling and anger management programs. David received 2 years with similar conditions for early release. Additionally, Judge Martinez said, you are both permanently prohibited from having any contact with the victim Caleb Harper, either directly or through third parties. This restraining order will remain in effect even after your release from prison. Both parents were ordered to pay full restitution for all stolen inheritance money, fraudulently obtained family donations, and legal expenses related to the prosecution. The total amount exceeded $300,000 when penalties and interest were included. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood and faced my parents directly. I want you to know that Caleb is thriving. I said, my voice steady and clear. He's an honor roll student who loves science and animals. He has friends who appreciate his unique perspective on the world. He's learning to play guitar and wants to study veterinary medicine when he grows up. Carol stared at me with cold hatred, but David looked down at his hands as I continued. You tried to convince everyone that he was a burden, that he needed to be hidden away in an institution, that his autism made him less valuable than other children. You were wrong about all of it. Caleb is a gift to everyone who knows him, and I'm grateful every day that I fought to protect him from people who couldn't see his worth. I paused, looking at both of them for what I knew would be the last time. I hope that someday you understand what you threw away. You could have had a relationship with an amazing grandchild who would have brought joy and wonder to your lives. Instead, you chose money and control. That was your loss, not ours. As I sat down, I realized that speaking those words had completed something important for me. I'd stopped seeking their approval or understanding. I'd stopped hoping they would change or apologize. I'd accepted that some people are incapable of love without conditions, and that my job wasn't to fix them, but to protect myself and my son from their toxicity. 6 months later, I received a letter from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation that began with my case had resulted in the prosecution of 12 additional defendants across 3 counties. 7 families had been reunited with children who had been wrongfully placed in residential care. Over $500,000 in stolen inheritance and benefit money had been recovered. Your courage in reporting these crimes and providing evidence for prosecution has had far-reaching effects beyond your own case, the letter read. Multiple victims have been able to seek justice and rebuild their lives because of your willingness to fight back against a sophisticated criminal enterprise. I framed that letter and hung it in my home office, where I now worked as a victim advocate specializing in family fraud cases. My sociology degree had led to a master's program in social work, and I'd found my calling in helping other families navigate the legal and emotional complexities of escaping abusive family dynamics. Caleb, now 10 years old, had grown into a confident child who advocated for himself and others. He'd started a club at school to educate students about autism and other differences, helping create a more inclusive environment for all the kids who didn't fit traditional molds. "Mom, did you know that autism is just a different way of thinking?" he told me after one of his presentation days. "Some kids didn't know that before, but now they understand that being different can be really cool." My son had taken the experience of being targeted for his differences and transformed it into a mission to help other children embrace their uniqueness. He'd turned our trauma into his strength. Last month, I met a woman named Sandra whose situation eerily paralleled what ours had been 2 years earlier. Her mother-in-law was filing false social services reports while pressuring Sandra to consider residential care for her autistic daughter. Her husband was beginning to believe his mother's claims that Sandra was making their daughter worse by accommodating her sensory needs. "I feel like I'm going crazy," Sandra told me during our first meeting. "Everyone keeps telling me I'm overprotective and that I'm not doing what's best for my daughter, but she's happy at home with me. She's learning and growing and developing relationships. How can that be wrong?" I helped Sandra document the manipulation tactics, organize evidence of the false reports, and connect with legal representation. Within 3 months, her mother-in-law was facing criminal charges for harassment and filing false reports, and Sandra's marriage was stronger because her husband finally understood how his mother had been undermining their family. "You saved us," Sandra said when the case was resolved. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found someone who understood what we were going through." These cases have taught me that my parents' crimes weren't aberrations. Family manipulation and financial exploitation are more common than most people realize, especially when vulnerable children and government benefits are involved. But they've also taught me that with proper support and evidence, victims can fight back successfully. Last week, Caleb and I attended the wedding of my cousin Rachel, the first family celebration we'd participated in since cutting contact with my parents. Seeing Caleb dance with his great-aunt Linda, laugh with his second cousins, and confidently interact with relatives who genuinely cared about him, I realized how much healing had taken place. "Look, Mom," he said, pointing to a photo the wedding photographer had captured of him surrounded by smiling family members. "This is what a real family looks like." He was right. Real family doesn't manipulate or exploit. Real family doesn't see children as burdens or resources to be managed. Real family celebrates differences instead of trying to hide them, offers support without demanding control in return, and shows love through protection rather than exploitation. Tonight, as I tuck my son into bed in our beautiful home surrounded by 5 acres of nature, he loves to explore. I reflect on the journey that brought us here. It began with a moment of shocking cruelty when my sister sprayed perfume into my child's eyes while my parents laughed. It continued through months of discovery documentation and legal battles that tested every ounce of strength I possessed. But it ended with justice served, family healing, and a future filled with genuine love and unlimited possibilities for a remarkable child who almost became a victim of people too selfish to recognize his worth. "Mommy," Caleb says as I kiss him goodnight, "thank you for protecting me." "Thank you for being exactly who you are," I reply. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." As I turn off his bedroom light, I know that every battle we fought was worth it. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every painful family confrontation led us to this place of safety and authentic love. My son is safe. Justice has been served. And we've built the kind of family every child deserves, one based on unconditional love rather than conditional manipulation. The people who tried to destroy us ended up showing us our own strength. And that might be the greatest victory of all. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who didn't have your child's best interests at heart? How did you find the courage to put your child's safety above family loyalty? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story helped you recognize any concerning patterns in your own family dynamics, please don't hesitate to seek support from professionals who can help you protect yourself and your children. Thank you so much for listening to our journey from manipulation to healing. Your support means everything to families like ours who have found the strength to fight back against abuse disguised as love. Please like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over adversity, and share it with anyone who might need to know that they're not alone in facing family dysfunction. Remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to tolerate the unacceptable, even when it comes from the people who are supposed to love you most. I wish you and your families the kind of authentic love and protection that every child deserves. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never stop fighting for the people you love.